Let me start off by saying that I know this might be an unpopular video. I know that people feel strongly about this issue on both sides, and I don't want to talk down to or to demonize the people on the pro-mask side of the argument. I can respect that you're probably coming to the issue with real concerns and good intentions. All I ask in return is that you afford me the same respect and the same assumption of good intentions. I think a video is more appropriate to address these issues than in a regular post on Facebook, just because there's more space to expand on different thoughts. All I ask is that you give some serious consideration to the issues that I'm going to raise, and keep in mind the advice of the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 13. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. In other words, keep an open mind as you watch this video, and then decide afterwards whether or not you agree with me or you think I made any good points. I guess I'll begin by drawing an important distinction. I'm not anti-mask so much as I am anti-mask mandates. I see a lot of arguments from anti-mask people on social media and in real life that are centered around whether or not masks actually work, whether or not they in fact do more harm than good, and personal anecdotes about how they can't breathe when they're wearing them, things like that. All of that may be true, but even if it is, those arguments strike me as a bit disingenuous. At the very least, they're missing the real point. At the end of the day, no, it's not a terrible inconvenience to have to wear a mask to the store. Minus a few exceptions for people with pre-existing breathing conditions, it's not going to kill you. It's just not. As for whether or not they actually work, despite what we hear from certain media outlets, the science is in fact still out on that. But it does kind of make sense to me, logically, that at the very least, even if they do no good, they're probably not doing any harm either. So my concern isn't so much with the masks themselves or their effectiveness. My concern is with the compulsory orders and the conformist groupthink that's arisen around them. We are free human beings endowed with reason, and we have to be allowed the freedom to make our own risk assessments concerning what we do in our day-to-day lives. And if we don't defend our right to make risk assessments, it'll be taken away. It's already been encroached upon, little by little, for years. And it's funny that the pro-mask side uses these past encroachments to support further encroachment. Seatbelt laws are a great example of that. They strip the individual of the autonomy to make their own choices concerning their safety. They're unethical because they deprive human beings of what makes them human. I'll explain that in a minute. Bicycle helmets and motorcycle helmets are another good example. They're laws that deprive us of the ability to take on the dangers inherent in any semi-risky activity without interference from outside authority or legislation. Now, you can argue in both of those cases that laws should be in place to protect children. So maybe you should be allowed the choice of whether or not you want to risk not wearing a seatbelt because the consequences are on your own head. But if you have a child, they shouldn't have to suffer for your decisions. And so therefore, requiring car seats, seat belts, or helmets for minors is a just law. But when it comes to adults with free will, nobody has the right to tell them how to live their lives, as long as they're not harming others, which again, we'll get to in a minute. I would argue that free will is what makes us human. Now, this is a decidedly Christian position to take. Even God allows us the free will and the agency to carry out our own actions and suffer the consequences from them. It's the age-old answer to the question of, if God is good, then why is there evil in the world? Because this choice of the individual is so important to God himself that it's worth sacrificing an alternate world where men are as good as angels, but automatons at the same time. This means accepting that people will make right choices, and maybe wearing masks is a right choice. But it also means accepting that they're going to abuse their free will by making wrong choices. In his book, The Problem of Pain, the theologian and philosopher C.S. Lewis explores this hypothetical alternate world. He says, "We can perhaps conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will by his creatures at every moment, so that a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set up in it the sound waves that carry lies or insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which, therefore, freedom of the will would be void. Nay, if the principle were carried on to its logical conclusion, evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame them. All matter in the neighborhood of a wicked man would be liable to undergo unpredictable alterations. That God can and does on occasions modify the behavior of matter and produce what we call miracles is part of Christian faith. But the very conception of a common and therefore stable world demands that these occasions should be extremely rare. In a game of chess, you can make certain arbitrary concessions to your opponent which stand to the ordinary rules of the game as miracles stand to the laws of nature. You can deprive yourself of a castle or allow the other man sometimes to take back a move made inadvertently. But if you concede everything that at any moment happened to suit him, if all his moves were revocable, and if all your pieces disappeared whenever their position on the board was not to his liking, then you could not have a game at all. So it is with the life of souls in a world. Fixed laws, consequences unfolding by causal necessity, the whole natural order are at once limits within which their common life is confined, and also the sole condition under which any such life is possible. Try to exclude the possibility of suffering, which the order of nature and the existence of free will involve, and you find that you have excluded life itself. So he's saying that not even God interferes with people's free will, because to do so would be to make life cease to be life. If we conceptualize life as an arena in which actors make individual choices that affect real change in that arena. Deprive life of those choices and changes, and you no longer have life, but a still picture or a portrait in which everyone may be happy and safe, but they're deprived of all agency. Again, maybe refusing to wear a mask is a wrong choice, but preserving the right to make wrong choices is more important than legislating a world into existence which provides security and safety, but excludes freedom. And in any case, it isn't a government's job, local or federal, to try to do so. At least not a government such as the one America is supposed to be. We all probably know these words by now from the Declaration of Independence, because we had to memorize them, of course, in school, but I'll go ahead and read them again to you anyway. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it gives the reason for government's existence in that passage, to preserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's nothing in there about safety. There's nothing in there about health. And governments that try to regulate this often fail. And they fail because it isn't in human nature to be pampered and coddled, kept in a protective bubble, secure from all risks. The government isn't supposed to be a nanny or a hall monitor. It's supposed to stay out of its citizens' way as much as possible and let them experience the triumphs and failures of the great adventure of life for themselves. In his novella Notes from Underground, Fyodor Dostoevsky's protagonist rails against these systems that would attempt to control every aspect of their citizens' lives for their own good or for the greater good. The ones that would so fine-tune society that all of its people will live and act in harmony like keys on a piano. He says that human nature itself will never let such a system function. He says, Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is a being endowed with such strange qualities? Shower upon him every earthly blessing. Drown him in a sea of happiness, so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species, and even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men still are men and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude, simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive sufferings of all sorts, only to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between him and other animals. Maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object, that is, convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. So this is an important aspect of being human, in other words, being able to make wrong choices, uneconomical choices. And if wearing a mask is a wrong choice, being able to make that choice, being allowed that reign to learn things for yourself, especially when the consequences of that choice only affect you. Which brings us to another pro-mask argument, and I think the more powerful one, which is that you wear a mask to protect others, but not yourself. In his essay on liberty, John Stuart Mill makes the argument that my liberty ends where your liberty begins. He's not the only one to make that argument, but he's the one I'm most familiar with. So, my ability to make free choices only extends so far as I'm not hurting other people, because then I'm interfering with their lives and their own decision-making processes. And that's why I allowed for the exception to the seatbelts and helmet rules earlier. A child doesn't deserve to be affected by the consequences of their parents' decision. It's why laws against drinking and driving are just laws, because other people can get hurt if you do that and you crash your car or something. I'm more sympathetic to this concern, but I fail to see how other precautions aside from masks can't provide the same level of safety that wearing a mask would. Keeping 6 feet away from people isn't unreasonable, and if the 6 feet regulation actually works, and I'm assuming it does unless the CDC pulled that number out of a hat, then masks are superfluous. They're especially superfluous if person A, who has health issues, is wearing a mask because that was a precaution that they decided to take, and person B, who isn't wearing one, is standing 6 feet away. Sure, maybe there's an extra layer of protection, which is nice, but if it's not really needed, why should we be forced to do it under compulsion? And where does it end? Maybe person A and person B should both be wearing 2 masks apiece. After all, it's objectively safer, but you can see that that argument becomes absurd. If the government's going to enforce anything, it should be the bare minimum regulations. And while I do think this is a better argument, it's clear that the powers that be don't really care about this concern. The giveaway is the insistence that everyone wear their masks properly and keep their noses covered. Maybe me covering my mouth keeps another person protected because air particles aren't traveling, but me having my nose uncovered only affects me, unless I sneeze, I guess. Unless they're saying now that the virus travels out of the body through the nose, and maybe they are. Someone can correct me on that. But to me, it seems like a disingenuous argument for these governors and corporations to be making. I'll conclude by saying something about the fair critique that I'm seeing from many of the pro-mask people about a business's right to refuse entry to a customer who won't wear a mask. I completely agree, and I think it's really unfair to argue with or rail against a cashier at a grocery store for trying to enforce a mask policy that came down from corporate. A business has the right to refuse service to anyone for any reason, although there might be some uncomfortable implications to that if it's applied as a one-size-fits-all policy, but that's a conversation for another video. But you won't get a complaint from me if you turn me out of a store for not wearing a mask. We have the freedom to make choices, but not freedom from the consequences of those choices. I've spent a lot of time asking myself these questions. At what point do I say, enough? There are pickup services at many supermarkets, so I don't have to go into the stores. And if I need to, I'll drive out of state to get what I need. It'll be kind of a long drive, but there are states around the one where I live where mandates are less restrictive. And if it's that important to me, I should be able to make that sacrifice of time and gas money. But nobody is going to be inconvenienced for my decision. You've probably noticed that in this video I've purposely stayed away from science-based arguments, and that's because anyone who is being honest has to concede that the statistics are all over the place on this one. Nobody knows who to believe. One minute the Surgeon General is begging people not to buy masks. The next minute he's saying buy masks. The World Health Organization says that if you are asymptomatic you shouldn't be wearing masks. Now they're saying you should. The confusion and the uncertainty in themselves are enough of a reason not to be mad at people for deciding not to wear masks. After all, it's the responsibility of the authorities to be authoritative, and if they've lost the public trust, they've got nobody to blame for that but themselves. But in any case, I've restricted my discussion in this video to an arena where you and I and everyone is competent enough to make informed decisions. That of ethics, of morality, of basic right and wrong. As I said at the beginning, I'm not judging or condemning anyone who decides to wear a mask. I think there are good reasons to do so. I just ask that you afford my decision the same respect. I think this sets a bad precedent when it comes to compulsory rules and legislation, and I don't think enough people are taking the anti-mask side or hearing them out. And to me, freedom is more important than safety. I asked myself if I would maintain that position if I happened to get the virus, if I had to go to the hospital or be put on a ventilator. This isn't a flippant decision. I've thought through the consequences, in other words. And I guess you never really know until push comes to shove, but for right now, I think, yes, I would maintain what I've said here. As for transmitting it to someone else, which is a bit more sobering of a thought, I've taken precautions in my life to prevent that. If my daily business takes me into a doctor's office or somewhere where I know there is someone who is at risk, sure, I'll put on a mask. I haven't seen my grandparents in months. I give old people distance in public, and those seem like reasonable measures to me. None of us are going to live a moment longer or die a moment sooner than God wills it. And to me, that's an encouraging thought. Thank you for watching. I hope this gave you at least something to think about, even if you still disagree with me at the end of things. And have a good day.